So a couple of weeks ago we asked you guys in our last video to ask us your mushroom growing questions, and we got some great questions there. So in today's video we're going to be answering a load of them in some detail. Let's get started.
So today we'll be answering questions on mushroom substrate, your growing setup, and also on how to sell mushrooms. So it's going to be packed with good stuff.
We've done our best to try and cover, as many of them as we can, but we couldn't do them all. And so what we're going to do after today is we're going to drop down in the comment section of all the questions that people did leave for us last week, and we're going to answer every single one of them.
Let's get started.
Yep.
First up then, a question from Greg. How would you suggest a complete novice grow about 1 kilogram of mushrooms per week all year around for personal consumption of the easiest to grow variety? Right, so the answer there, my recommendation is to use oyster mushrooms and grow them on straw pellets hydrated with water. And in terms of getting 1 kilogram each week, what you want to be having is bags of 4 kilogram in weight. So the substrate weight in total needs to be about 4 kilograms. And then if you fruit them consistently, then you'll have about 1 kilogram for your personal consumption. And don't forget they'll be really fresh and tasty as well.
They will, yeah, and that really is the easiest method to do it. We actually have a video on that, which we'll link up here and in the description below, on just the easiest way to grow oyster mushrooms at home. Now in that video we talk about using straw pellets, but if you can't source straw pellets you could also use hardwood pellets, and then potentially you might want to supplement them with 20% of soybean hull pellets or the sugar beet pellets. And then when it comes to the fruiting stage, really the easiest thing you can do is just pick a spot somewhere in your house or maybe outside that's naturally shaded, and then just mist them manually with water 2 or 3 times a day. To go a step beyond that, you can create a small fruiting chamber, something like a shotgun fruiting chamber, which we cover in a bit more detail in our workshop, which we'll also link up to here.
Exactly, and you won't need it for 1 kilogram of mushrooms each week, but another one is one of those 4-tier greenhouses, which are really simple to set up and really simple to create some good environmental conditions in. So next up, a question from Theodore, who asks, is there a low-tech way of growing shiitake or other species than oyster? And I've got some bags here of shiitake, and this is grown on bran and sawdust, and it's sterilized first, and lots of growers opt to grow shiitake in that way. It is, however, not the only way to grow. You can also grow on pasteurized straw. We know of a couple of very large producers on mainland Europe who sell bales in this way, but I do want to point out to you that using the lime bath technique is not very successful with shiitake, and when you use pasteurized straw to grow shiitake, it's important for you to realize that there are some strains that have been developed to grow on this straw specifically. Then also, when it comes to other species, I just wanted to add that reishi and turkey tail are 2 species that you can grow on 100% hardwood pellets. What you want to do though before using them is just rehydrate them. And the main reason you're off with those 2 species in that situation is because they're really aggressive colonizers, and of course that's what you're looking for when it comes to growing using low-tech techniques. Now, have you looked into how much supplementation can you get away with on hardwood pellets while still just pasteurizing? And that's Adam's question. Adam?
Yes, so to answer that question, first of all, we can look in our own production here. We add around about 10% alfalfa pellets to our straw substrate. That works very, very well and quite reliably. And just to go back to what I said earlier about straw is already quite a rich substrate, has a good level of nitrogen in it. And so we're adding addition to that and having good results for that. Now you're asking about hardwood sawdust and how much additional supplementation you can add to that and still only be pasteurizing. And really I'd say this is an area of mushroom cultivation where people are really still exploring. We have many members in our online course community who are successfully growing on a mix, basically the master's mix, mix of 50% hardwood pellets with 50% soybean hulls. And they're simply just adding cold water to the pellets, allowing them to hydrate, adding their spawn, and having pretty good results like that. Now I will say that there's other people who do exactly that same thing, and they're having bags go moldy. So I think it's not clear exactly under what scenarios it works and what scenarios it doesn't work, and this is an area for people to learn a little bit more about. What we find when growing on straw with pasteurized substrate is once you get to around about 25% supplementation or above, then you start to see increased levels of contamination. Really, it's not worth pushing it that much further because the benefit to the yield is not there to be had. Really, you're just increasing your chances of contamination. So the other thing to add though, if you are wanting to grow a wider variety of mushrooms, but you're using a low-tech pasteurization only method, is You could choose to just use that method and grow oyster mushrooms, and there's a range of oysters that you can grow like that. And then you could choose to just buy in substrate of other varieties if you want to provide a wider range of species.
So the next question then from Candice, who likes to grow shiitake and use pasteurised wood pellets. I sometimes have mould, she says, and not sure why. And then there's a second question, what amount of hydrated lime should I use for water pasteurisation? Now, when it comes to shiitakes, the important thing to bear in mind is that it's got a longer incubation period than, for instance, oysters. And that fact alone means that competing moulds have got more time to compete with your shiitake mycelium. So key here to combat that would be to use really aggressive strains. So a lower 75 is one, and then 3782 is another one that you can use. The other thing you want to bear in mind is just to get the growing conditions absolutely right. So important is the air exchange in the incubation phase. You want to make sure the temperature is absolutely spot on in an exact range for the shiitake strain that you're using. Be careful also not to overhydrate your substrate, and you might want to increase your spawn rate so that you get higher speed of colonization. Now, the second question you asked about the lime bath, the answer to that question is 0.2% lime to water weight. But I do want to remind you as well that certain shiitake strains just don't really get on with this pasteurization method, so look for others.
So the next question we got here then comes from Craterope, and they're wondering about wood ash pasteurization. Some say it doesn't work and others say it gives the best biological efficiency. Have you had any experience with this? Yes, we have had experience with this. Wood ash works in a very similar way to hydrated lime, which is how we normally pasteurize our substrate. It raises the pH of the water in which you soak the substrate, and that knocks out most competing organisms. And it does work really well. The crops that we grew with wood ash were of a really high quality. The caps were really dense, nice dark colors. The downside was just how much wood ash you need to use in order to raise that pH level up to around about 12. You use 3% of the weight of the water, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but it is actually quite a lot when you come to take that much wood ash. It's quite a light material, and in comparison, something like hydrated lime, you only add at 0.2%, which is around about 15 times less. Give you an idea of this then, when we pasteurize in an IBC container like this, we might have 600 litres of water. When we're using hydrated lime at 0.2%, we're only adding 1.2 kilos of hydrated lime. When you're using wood ash, you need to use 18 kilograms of wood ash, and try and imagine what that looks like. I mean, wood ash is a very light material. That's a lot of wood that needs to be burnt in order to create that much ash. And if you wanted to go and buy it, we had a little look around. For example, someone was selling it on Etsy for 14 English pounds for just a bag that was 400 grams. If you were to buy 18 kilos of ash in that way, it's going to cost you over 600 English pounds in order to get enough ash to pasteurize your waters. In comparison, something like hydrated lime, you're only going to be needing around about 1 pound's worth. So it's about 600 times more expensive to use. We recommend it. It is a good way to pasteurize, but it's just not very practical to do on an ongoing basis.
So our next question is from Bernam, who asks, what is the best method for inoculating mushroom substrate? Is inoculating with liquid culture something I should do, or inoculate a bag of seeds and use that as spawn? Now, the quick answer here is that liquid cultures aren't ideal to introduce to your substrate straight away. But the good news is that you can use it in your growing as a small-scale mushroom grower, because you can introduce it into a bag of grain, and then you've got the grain spawn that you can then introduce onto your substrate. My recommendation here is to use the liquid culture, put it onto grain, then it can benefit from all the nutrients, and once you've got the grain spawn, you can introduce it into your substrate. Once it's broken up like this, there are so many inoculation points, we call them, and from there it can easily leap onto your substrate and start to colonize. So this is ready to go into our mixer later on today.
This question we got here then is from Celtic Lass, and she's wondering what type of substrate you can use. So she's saying, you know, oyster mushrooms can grow on a wide range of substrates, but how do we know if a substrate is going to be good or not? Does it need to be high in carbon or carbohydrates? And are things like coffee grounds, which are quite high in nitrogen, are they best used as a substrate amendment rather than being the substrate itself? So this is a great question. It's exactly the kind of thing that we hear all the time, because people, you know, rightfully so, are wanting to make sure they get their substrate right. The important thing to think here about is you want a material that is very rich in carbon. That's the main food source that the mushrooms are going to be feeding off of. So something like straw, for example, very rich in hemicellulose, lignin and cellulose. But you also want a range of other minerals, and in particular you're looking for some nitrogen as well. So the ideal level of nitrogen in the substrate would be around about 1%. Something like straw has around about 0.5% nitrogen, and that really just depends on the conditions in which it was grown as to how much nitrogen ends up in the straw. Usually you might then look to add some kind of supplement to that to bring the level up to 1%. So you might add something like bran, or you might use soy hulls, or indeed something like coffee grounds. And that's exactly why people add in a lot of supplementation to sawdust. So sawdust has a much lower level of nitrogen in it. Because of that, people are then adding in things like soy hulls or bran at a much higher percentage in order to bring up the overall nitrogen content. So these are some of the main things you want to be thinking about. And if you're just looking around you and wondering, you know, can this agricultural byproduct be used or not, I'd really recommend having a look online for the Mush World Oyster Mushroom Growers Guide. In that guide, they have a chapter and they list out more than 200 varieties of agricultural byproduct that can be used successfully as a substrate for mushroom cultivation, and that would be a really good place to start when you're trying to investigate, seeing if the materials that you've got in your area around you are something that you can use.
So H. Durand wanted to know to what depth using brewery spent grain as a substrate has been covered.
So we did actually trial this quite a few years back, and we had a lot of high hopes for it. Obviously it's similar concept to using spent coffee grounds. It's freshly pasteurised from the brewing process. And it's still, you know, a good nutrient-rich material. We did have some results with it, but it was very 50-50. 50% of the time it worked well, 50% of the time we ended up with bags of either green mould or very bacterial contamination on the substrate. So the problem I think with it is, and this is what we concluded from it, was that when the spent brewery waste comes out, it's extremely wet, it's overhydrated, and that leads to problems with contamination. In addition to that, oftentimes we were getting that waste 2 or even 3 days after the brewing had finished. Now if you think about it, the spent grain is covered in sugars on the brewing process, so it's a feeding ground really for bacteria to take hold. Especially in the summertime, if a barrel of this grain was sat down at the brewery for a couple of days before we got to it, by the time we picked it up you could smell it straight away, couldn't you? It had this sort of bacterial sour smell.
Well, when it did work, of course, it's just such a cool concept. It's like reusing the spent coffee grounds, like you did say, and then we picked up some brewery waste and then it did work. And what happened with that was quite unusual in the sense that the mushrooms that we grew on waste materials such as the spent grain and coffee grounds, the brewery then used them to brew a stout. Do you remember?
Mushroom stout.
Mushroom stout, and the stout was called circular stout, and I think that just highlights how cool the concept is. It really fires people up, and I'm glad that you thought of this question.
I think it could work as a supplement to substrates. So maybe if you're sterilising your substrate and you're looking for some additional nutrient that you can add back in.
So Emma asked us, can you hang pre-made bales under a tree? And the answer is yes, of course you can. We've grown plenty of mushrooms outside. What you want to be looking for is a nice dappled space like the one behind me. You can hang it there. You can maybe even add a misting system if you feel like creating better conditions for your mushroom bales. Now the main downside of this, we've done that in a video that I'll link to, by the way, and the main downside of growing outside, of course, is the existence of pests. So flies, maggots, slugs. We've lost some King Stropharia that we picked a little bit too late to slugs, for instance, which can be really frustrating. So as a one-off grow, yes you can. If you are willing to take those risks, then that's absolutely fine. As a commercial sort of setup, you'd have to go for a fruiting room, really. I mean, we have grown plenty of mushrooms outside.
Going back probably 10 years or so now, we built a whole growing setup outside, actually, around some scaffolding with some shade netting and a misting system. And I'd say for the first month or so, it performed really well, didn't it?
Yeah.
You can see in these pictures here, really nice crops, great conditions that were created in that environment. But the problem set in around about a month on, where we started to build up a population of mushroom flies that were coming in, laying their eggs in the mushrooms, and the mushrooms were just crawling with maggots. And that problem just got worse and worse to the point where, you know, we had to shut the space down.
And that setup that Adam was describing was more of a test setup, and it worked, like he said, for quite a while. We were really getting into growing on coffee at that time, and we just wanted to do it separate in a separate area and see how that went. So that was the main justification there. So a related question to where you're fruiting your mushrooms and needing a room or not needing a room is from Tafabla. Why do you need a separate room? Why can't you grow and fruit in the same room as you do the incubation? It's a very good question, actually.
It is a good question because actually many mushroom farms, especially the bigger ones, will do exactly that. They'll fill the room up with a substrate, it'll go through the incubation, they'll change the conditions in the same room for the mushrooms to fruit. And if you think about it, it's a lot more efficient to do it like that. You don't need to move the bags around a second time from one room to the next.
It's a complete dream, isn't it? Just a trolley and
move it
in there once. And
The downside to it, of course, is that you then need many rooms like that. If you're to have an ongoing production, it means you're making new substrate every week, and you then need to have a room for every week of your production cycle. So something like oyster mushrooms, the production cycle is relatively short. You might be 5 to 6 weeks. That means you're going to need at least 6 rooms where you can sort of fill with substrate, run through all stages in the same room. So you can, of course, do it like that.
But as a small scale grower, you would be replicating all the costs, of course, for each and every one of those rooms. And that's, I think, the reason why it's mainly done by larger growers.
Yeah, most smaller growers, they'll have at least 2 rooms, and obviously each room has got different conditions. The incubation room is dry, which is one of the main differences. It's a little bit warmer. Fruit room is humid, lots of fresh air, it has light. So you've got 2 different conditions that you need. So you kind of need 2 different spaces if you don't have room for, you know, many different rooms, like we said.
Absolutely.
There's a question here we got from James, who's wondering what we do with all our spent substrate, and is it easy to sell as spent compost? So what we do with our substrate here, you can see behind me, we just have an area that we compost it in. It takes around about 6 to 12 months after you dump your spent blocks out here in order for it to compost down and turn into something like a rich mulch, which in our situation, we just then donate it to our neighbours next to us here, which is an organic CSA veg box scheme. So they make use of it. And really, you can bag it up and sell it, but what I would say about that is that it's very hard to make that feasible. It takes quite a lot of time, and then the price that you'll receive in return per bag of compost is pretty low, and that's really just because commercial composting operations operate, you know, on an industrial scale, and people are used to paying very small amounts. So some other things that you could consider doing then. So you could just offer it for free in your local area. It's a bit of goodwill in your community, and you can promote a little bit of your farm business. You might find the people come and buy compost will also buy mushrooms from you, for example. You could donate it to schools. They can always use free compost. If you're interested in producing worms, for example, it could be a foodstuff for that. You can also consider drying the blocks out. So instead of breaking them up into small pieces, you can dry them out and use them in a biomass boiler if you have a suitable boiler that can take that kind of material. But ultimately what you've got is a very dry, carbon-rich material which still has some value as a fuel source. We've actually also heard from people who are using dehydrated substrate blocks as a building material, so that's another interesting thing that people like to do with them.
So then we got a whole bunch of questions relating to selling the mushrooms. So number one is obviously how much can you sell them for, and the other one, people seem to be wondering about how you can sell them, and I can really relate to that because that's an important step and it can be a bit nerve-wracking, right?
Yeah, definitely. I remember that myself. When you're first trying to sell your mushrooms, you can feel a lot of uncertainties around it, but in our experience those uncertainties are not necessary, that people generally just really happy to see these amazing fresh mushrooms presented to them. So anyway, let's start with the question then, how much can you sell the mushrooms for? So let's just look at oyster mushrooms in the UK as an example. You're going to be able to sell them for around about £15 per kilogram if you're selling direct to the customer. So for example, at farmers markets, if you split them up into punnets. If you're going to be selling to perhaps a retail outlet like a health food store or maybe a farm shop, usually you could sell at sort of 10 to 12 pounds a kilo. They'll put their markup on top of that. And if you're selling directly to a wholesaler, then price is going to be lower there, probably looking at around about £7 to £9 a kilo, roughly speaking, depending on the quality of the wholesaler, whether you're organically certified or not. Those are the sort of prices that you're looking at. And then in terms of where you sell them to, a lot of people look to restaurants first of all, for good reason, because they're one of the main buyers of mushrooms. And in terms of how to approach them, well, really you've got to get out there with your mushrooms and go around to the restaurants and give samples around. And you want to select the restaurants that you think in your area are most likely to buy from you. The sorts of places that talk about buying local produce, charge higher prices for their meals, and really are sorts of places that value the provenance of what they're cooking with, and that's a big part of what they do. So if you go to those places first, you want to pick a quiet time of day to go, either first thing in the morning if they're open then, or early evening, sort of late afternoon, early evening when the chefs are prepping ready for the evening. The best advice I would give, I think, is just to turn it with a decent quantity of mushrooms, maybe a kilogram tray at the least. Have a little bit of a chat if you can. Obviously, don't overdo it. If you see that they're busy, just leave the tray with them. But you want to include in there either a business card or maybe just a little leaflet with your contact details so they can get in touch. If you don't hear from them, probably most likely scenario, because chefs are very busy people, just follow up 2 to 3 days later, either go back in person and ask how they like the mushrooms, or you can ring them up. But really what you're looking for is to try and pin them down to a regular weekly order. Once you've got 1 or 2 restaurants on board, it's much easier to go to the others and then say, so-and-so is buying from us, and then the other restaurants feel a sense of obligation to kind of keep up. That's how I'd approach selling to restaurants. And if you're interested in finding out more, we've got an article on our site all about how to sell mushrooms to restaurants. So it's possibly a more challenging place to start selling though, I think.
Well, the thing is that chefs can be quite scary people. They've got knives and all that sort of stuff, but they can also be demanding in terms of, I need exactly this amount, because they've got a certain number of covers to prepare and guests to serve, of course. So it might well be that farmers markets or selling to local outlets will just suit your growing better. So that's the other way of going about it now. And before we go on to the final question, I just wanted to say thanks so much for all those questions, of course. Adam already mentioned we will reply to all of those questions in the comment section. So if your question wasn't answered in this video, don't despair, just go and check in what the comment is that you'll find below your question. And now on to that final question, can you make a living out of it?
Question we get almost every day. Obviously it's one of the main things people are interested in, and of course it doesn't have such a clear-cut answer. So broadly speaking, yes, you can make a living out of this, but there's a whole load of factors that come into play with that in terms of the scale, country you're in, the going rate for the produce, what kind of costs you've got in your individual situation, whether you own a building already or not, whole host of different factors that mean it's simply not possible to say yes or no.
And we've got this covered in our free workshop, A Starter Guide to Mushroom Farming.
So I'd recommend checking that out. That's the workshop. We've got part 4, we specifically address that question of whether you can make a living out of it or not, and we've taken the time to answer this question in a bit more detail there. So we'll link that up at the end of this video. It will be an option for you to click on for the next video to watch. So go ahead and watch that and let us know what you think.